purpose. Lynch talks about prescriptive purpose and emergent purpose, and not spend a lot of time on this, but simply say that when we talk about prescriptive purpose, he's saying that it's very often something that's associated with objectives like return on capital, earnings per share, etc. It's quite clear and well defined. Then we have the emergent purpose, more kind of open. We may not really be able to define it, but it's also something that will work better in an environment that is quite uncertain. And he also claims that it's better for encouraging innovation and initiative in an organization. Good. So we have developed the purpose of the organization, and now let's start to say that we have purpose as an overall idea. This is where we are at right now. Are we going to survive? Okay, can we still have the vision? Yes, we can. What kind of stakeholder power? Well, we would need to take a closer look at that. What is our mission and objectives? That can change when we have change in our purpose. So, in this case, how do we then identify a vision? And some says that it articulates a view of a realistic, credible, attractive future for the organization, a condition that is better in some important ways than what now exists. So it is about having an idea about the future, and it should be kind of realistic and attractive for the organization, because we also know that something that is realistic and attractive is more motivating for people to work with, and they can see themselves in that particular vision. And that means that a vision will help to point the way ahead for organizations. And we need to distinguish a vision from the purpose. That's why I started out with this little exercise with purpose, because vision, challenging, imaginative picture of the future, and purpose, the long-term specific strategic direction. And that can change overnight. Just think, maybe you cannot really remember, but you have certainly heard about what we call the financial crisis in the zeros, about 07 and 08. During that time, lots of companies overnight experienced that their markets were actually disappearing. So that means that lots of companies, instead of having a purpose of becoming something great or having growth and become the greatest whatever in the world, they simply changed the purpose to simple survival. That means they had to lay off people, they had to cut costs, they had to do a lot of things and take a lot of initiatives in order to make sure that they simply just survived. And right now we have the corona crisis, and lots of companies right now is also in a position where survival is simply the most important thing that they look at. We have lots of entertainment industries, restaurants, etc. right now. They are really under a lot of pressure because their customers is not able to visit them. And if they are, only in a more limited numbers. So we also right now have what we could call a crisis for lots of companies, where their purpose has gone from becoming the greatest whatever supplier of something in Denmark to simply survive and make sure that we are here. But they might still have this picture of the future. They haven't lost their dream, but right now they're simply working on survival. I would like to illustrate this in this way here. We have a vision, and that would be our leading star. So that is what we look at, and that is what helps us and guide us in our everyday life when we make decisions about how to go along with our company or our lives. Then we have the mission, and the mission, these are the guidelines that will take us to that particular vision. and the mission defines what business are we in, what are the values and beliefs of our organization, and how is it that we compete. So the mission kind of lay out these overall policies that we are working with. So if we have a vision that's religions, for example, if we take Christianity, we had at a point of time lots of our vision about that everybody in the whole world should be Christian people. And therefore we had missionaries going out on a mission, and their mission were to make sure that everybody they met would end up being a Christian. And how would they then do that? Well, they had these guidelines about, they knew what business they were in. They were in the business of making people convert to Christianity, etc. And then they would have objectives. And one objectives would be, okay, we will go to this particular country and we will have to make sure that every single week we have to baptize 50 people. That could be an overall objective that would help them reach their vision in the end. For companies, they also have visions about the future. They also have these mission policies guiding them to what to do, making sure that we are staying within the business that we have defined we're in, building on the values that we have, and making sure our resources is still living up to the competitive advantage that we are looking at. And then we also set up objectives for the years to come within finance and other strategic areas. And if we look at these here, we can see that marketing, and just turn it a bit, marketing, market share, for example, finance, debt ratios, cost of capital, etc. So these are the areas that we can look at and where we can set some objectives. So it might be a very good idea to set a market share objective, simply to understand what share do we need to have in order to reach our vision at the end. So setting goals is part of understanding the connection between vision, mission, and objectives. Good. And here is just a summation of what it is. I'm not going to say more about this. You can always go back and look at it if you want to. So, developing these objectives and also being input to our vision and mission is simply to start understanding our external environment, also called strategic context, external strategic context. And we dealt with that last week. And it's also about understanding our internal strategic context, that is our resources. And note that it says culture. Culture is also a resource, because that has to do with knowledge and capabilities and competences, how we work here and how we do things together. That's a capability, and that is also part of creating a specific culture. And that, of course, leads us to the SWOT. And that means that we now have to consider these areas at least when we develop objectives. What are the implications for objective setting imposed from the above? And let's try to take a closer look at these objectives and how we should work with them. So how to develop objectives? When we develop objectives, it is important that we recognize that there are quite different kinds of objectives. And please notice this, some will be quantified and some may not be quantified. So the difference between something that is quantitative and qualitative could be that we would like to have a specific amount of money in our cash flow that is quantified. We also have a specific market share, and then we could have something that we could say is not that quantifiable, but that could be working environment for our workers. It could be something about culture. So we could still measure it with specific scales that we have, attitude scales, etc. But that's not for this course to deal with. Then let's try to look at these here. The business objectives often need to be broken down into subsidiary objectives for areas such as marketing. We just looked at those. Now, we have these, in the last slide, we saw that we could deal with these different kinds of objectives, but what happens when we are dealing with them, and how do they work when we are taking the people issue into it? And that's something that we will look at in this slide here. First of all, when we have objectives, we might experience that there can be conflict between objectives, and especially between long-term and short-term interest. For example, Lynch gives here an example that if we want to build market share, that means we'll often sacrifice short-term profitability because building share is usually costly. Now, how does that add up? Well, for those of you who haven't had marketing, I'll just shortly explain it. This means that if we want to build market share, it means that we will have a larger part of the market. That means we are going to compete with our competitors. Now, if we want to compete with our competitors, it means we will have to spend money and resources on competing. And if we want to compete, we could, for one thing, we could start advertise more. So if we want to start to advertise more, it costs money. If we would like to promote our products more to retailers, we could hire more salespeople, but salespeople cost money. And we could also start spending money on different activities. We could start to use different kinds of media, but people need to take care of it, and people need to maintain our social media. But all of this costs money. And when we spend money, there's no guarantee that we will also sell more. So on the short run, here we are sacrificing short-term profitability. We're spending money, but we are spending money in order to hopefully, in the long run, build our market share. So often we will find that objectives, they can be going up against each other, and therefore we need to prioritize what do we want to do. Okay, what was one example? Then we could also have motivational issues. If objectives here, if they are too hard, they may not really motivate people. And if they're too easy, they do not motivate people as well. That could be one perspective. And very often you'll see that organizations, they have, well, up until at least 2010-15, they have really come on with motivating people by setting goals. So if you can reach this goal, then you will gain this and this. But right now we also see that there's a tendency for companies to start realize that especially new workers, newly educated people, they are not necessarily motivated by having specific goals that will give them more money or something. They might rather be motivated by having a challenging working environment where they can learn something and where they feel that they can make a difference to their environment, and figuring out how can we then make sure that I can be part of a company that would help our planet to exist also in 100 and 200 years. So we often see that today companies is having these discussions about challenging their employees by having more, not goals, but taking in the vision of the company to make sure that everybody is aligned with why are we here, and we are going for the good purpose. So we are always helping each other. That's something that we see today. Then we would have to develop a communication plan and hopefully a plan for implementing the objectives. So objectives, it's really a discussion for itself because it might sound pretty easy to set an objective, but it isn't. And if you just think about yourself again, I think that's a very good way to understand strategic management. Always bring in your own life, your own perspective. If you were to set an objective for yourself today about where would you like to be financially in 1 year, or where would you like to be with your studies in 1 year, where would you like to be, etc. You probably get the point. And then lots of different issues would need to be taken into consideration by you in order to set an objective for you. So even though that you would have to set the goal for yourself, it might be difficult for you to do it, because when you start setting goals for yourself, then are they realistic? And are you really going to do that? So you're starting to question whether you can do it or will do it. And when is the objective good enough, or ambitious enough, or motivating enough? So imagine you're going to help setting objectives for other people and organizations. It's really not an easy task. So that's why we need to have an understanding about objectives being a consequence of vision and mission and the purpose of the company. When we have that into consideration and understand our resources at the same time, it becomes a little bit easier to set out objectives.